Inside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, there is an apartment. It sits one floor below the Empress's private chambers, connected by a concealed staircase that no court circular ever mentioned. Over 34 years, at least 12 men moved into those rooms. Each reportedly received approximately 100,000 rubles, a full set of court clothing, and a household of servants on the day they arrived. Each redecorated at state expense. Each climbed the private staircase to the most powerful woman in Europe. And each, eventually, was replaced. The apartment survived. The system did not. The woman who built it was remembered for something else entirely. That apartment was not a secret. British and French ambassadors in St. Petersburg described it in official diplomatic dispatches. They reported who occupied the rooms, how long each man lasted, what gifts he received, and when the next replacement arrived. The concealed staircase connecting the favourite's quarters to Catherine's private chambers above was an architectural fact, built into the structure of the palace, maintained across decades, used by a rotating cast of guards officers whose careers, fortunes, and entire social positions depended on whether the Empress still wanted them climbing those stairs. The favourite's apartment was not a love affair. It was a machine. And the woman who designed that machine arrived in Russia at 14 years old with almost nothing. She was born Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729 in the Prussian city of Stettin. Her father, Christian August, held the rank of a Prussian general and served as governor of the city, a respectable post in a minor principality, but invisible on the scale of European great power politics. Her mother's wardrobe for the journey to Russia reportedly had to be partially borrowed from relatives. The family possessed no strategic territory, no significant fortune, no army, and no diplomatic weight in European politics. That was exactly the point. When Empress Elizabeth of Russia needed a bride for her nephew Peter, the heir to the Russian throne, she wanted a girl from a house too small to bring dangerous foreign alliances and too ambitious to refuse the offer. Sophie was useful precisely because she was powerless. She arrived in Moscow in 1744, converted to Russian Orthodoxy, took the name Ekaterina Catherine, and entered a court whose only expectation of her was a male heir. The marriage to Peter was, by almost every surviving account, catastrophic from the start. Catherine's own memoirs, which she wrote and revised across multiple drafts over decades, claim the union went unconsummated for 8 or 9 years. The exact duration has been debated by historians, but the central fact is not seriously contested. The marriage failed on its most basic dynastic terms for years. Peter was consumed by his native Holstein, by elaborate military drills conducted using toy soldiers arranged on tables, and by his open worship of Frederick the Great of Prussia, an admiration that bordered on obsession. He reportedly showed contempt for Catherine in front of courtiers, ignored her at public functions, and spent evenings drilling servants in Prussian military formations rather than attending to either his wife or his duties as heir. Catherine later described their private apartments as a space of mutual isolation. 2 people in the same residence, connected by title, separated by everything else. Catherine responded by doing what no one in the Russian court expected from a minor German bride selected for her compliance. She read Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, Voltaire, Tacitus. She studied Russian until she could speak it fluently, something Peter never bothered to do properly. She attended Orthodox services with visible devotion. She learned the names, ranks, grudges, and ambitions of the courtiers around her. She watched the political architecture of the Russian court, the way a strategist studies a battlefield, identifying who held influence, who wanted more, and who could be useful when the time came. The court had chosen her for her insignificance. That insignificance gave her the freedom to observe without being observed. And then Empress Elizabeth, who controlled the imperial court with absolute personal authority, reportedly took a step so extraordinary it destabilized the dynasty's foundation for generations. Catherine needed to produce an heir. The succession demanded it. After years of failure, Elizabeth, according to Catherine's later memoirs and supported by contemporary diplomatic gossip, either approved or actively arranged for a young guards officer named Sergei Saltykov to become Catherine's lover. Saltykov was charming, well-connected, and a member of the Imperial Guards, the same military caste that had placed Elizabeth herself on the throne through a palace coup in 1741. In 1754, Catherine gave birth to a son, Paul. Elizabeth immediately seized the infant. She took the child from Catherine's rooms, installed him under her own supervision, and raised him with governesses and tutors of her choosing. Catherine was not permitted to see her own son freely. The heir existed. The dynasty was satisfied. And the question of whether Paul's biological father was Peter or Sergei Saltykov was left permanently, deliberately unresolved. Catherine's memoirs strongly imply Saltykov was the father. Peter publicly accepted Paul. No DNA analysis has ever been performed. The most powerful empire in Europe built its future succession on a child whose paternity the imperial family chose not to investigate. That silence was not carelessness, it was policy. And Saltykov, the first guard, quietly disappeared from Catherine's life and from the inner circles of the court. He had served his purpose. In the late 1750s, Catherine took a second lover, Stanisław Poniatowski, a Polish nobleman with charm, sophistication, and connections to the European Enlightenment. Poniatowski gave Catherine something Saltykov had not: an intellectual partnership, philosophical conversation, a window into the world of ideas that was reshaping how educated Europeans thought about law, governance, and individual rights. Catherine absorbed it hungrily. She would later use those ideas to write legal codes, found institutions, and correspond as an equal with the greatest minds in Europe. She would also, years later, use her imperial power to install Poniatowski as King of Poland, then participate in the 3 partitions that erased his kingdom from the map entirely. The woman who loved him made him a king. The empress who succeeded her destroyed everything he was supposed to rule. But that consequence was still years away. In the late 1750s, Catherine was still the overlooked wife of an increasingly erratic heir, watching the court from behind borrowed books and a borrowed name. Empress Elizabeth died in January 1762. Peter became Tsar Peter III. His reign lasted approximately 186 days, and almost every one of them was a political catastrophe. He withdrew Russia from the 7 Years' War, surrendering hard-won military gains to make peace with Frederick the Great. The army was furious. He proposed reforms to the Russian Orthodox Church that alienated the clergy. He offended the aristocracy with open displays of Prussian cultural preference. He wore a Holstein military uniform at court. He drilled palace guards in Prussian formations. And most fatally, he alienated the Imperial Guards regiments stationed in St. Petersburg, the Preobrazhensky, the Semyonovsky, the Izmailovsky. The Horse Guards, the same units that had placed every ruler on the Russian throne through palace coups since 1725. In 18th century Russia, the throne did not pass through law, it passed through the barracks. Catherine had already found her next lover, and this time the relationship carried the weight of a conspiracy. Grigory Orlov was an officer who had served in the artillery and risen through the Guards regiments. He was physically imposing, charismatic, politically aggressive. and one of 5 brothers, all of them guards officers, all of them loyal to Catherine, and all of them willing to organize a coup. By 1760, Catherine and Grigory Orlov were lovers. By the summer of 1762, she was pregnant with his child. The timeline is stunning. On the 9th of July 1762, the Izmailovsky and Semyonovsky regiments proclaimed Catherine empress. She rode to the barracks wearing a borrowed guards officer's uniform, rallying soldiers who had sworn oaths to her husband. She was carrying the unborn child of one of the men who had organized his overthrow. Peter was arrested, forced to sign an abdication document at the Palace of Oranienbaum, and transferred under guard to the estate at Ropsha, a modest building far from the grandeur of the imperial residences. 8 days later, Peter was dead. The official cause of death was announced as hemorrhoidal colic. Nobody believed it then. Nobody believes it now. A letter attributed to Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother, and reportedly the man most directly present at Ropsha during Peter's final hours, described a violent confrontation in which Peter was killed. The letter's precise authenticity has been debated for over 2 centuries, but its substance is accepted by most historians. Catherine published a restrained statement of grief. She ordered no independent investigation. The man she had replaced was silenced permanently, and the official narrative of his death was now hers to control. The shadow of that death hung over every year of her reign. Her enemies would use it. Her lovers would benefit from it. Her son would never forgive it. The child Catherine carried during the coup was born later in 1762. A boy. He was given the name Alexei and the surname Bobrinsky. He was raised away from court, acknowledged privately, supported financially, granted an estate, but never made a public figure. He existed as a living consequence of the favourite system. The physical evidence of how Catherine's political alliances and intimate relationships were one and the same. With Peter dead and the throne secured, Catherine began constructing the machinery of favouritism that would define her private life and public reputation for 34 years. Grigory Orlov was the first official favourite of her reign. The rewards he received were staggering. He was given vast estates, thousands of serfs, enormous sums of money, and the commission to build the Marble Palace in St. Petersburg. Construction began in 1768 and took nearly 17 years to complete, at a cost that strained even imperial resources. The Orlov diamond, a massive gemstone with a disputed provenance tracing through India, Persia, and an Armenian merchant, was reportedly presented to Catherine by Grigory and subsequently mounted in the imperial scepter. A lover's private gift became part of the physical apparatus of state authority. But Orlov was never made consort. Catherine had used the guards to seize the throne. She would not share the crown with any of them. The pattern was established early and held for decades. The favourite received wealth, proximity, political access, and social prestige. He did not receive institutional power. The distinction was Catherine's most disciplined political calculation. The daily life of a favourite followed a routine as structured as any court protocol. Morning visits to Catherine's private chambers via the concealed staircase, shared meals, attendance at her card games and evening gatherings, prominence at court events, diplomatic receptions, and the intimate suppers held at the small hermitage, Catherine's private gallery space, where selected courtiers gathered for art, music, and conversation that blurred the boundary between social life and political access. The favourite managed petitions, influenced appointments, and controlled access to Catherine in ways that gave him substantial informal power. Courtiers, foreign ambassadors and ministers understood that reaching the empress often meant passing through the favourite first. When a favourite was dismissed, the procedure was generous, but efficient. The outgoing man received a severance package, additional estates, serfs, cash, and sometimes a diplomatic posting abroad that removed him from the court entirely. The exit was managed with enough money to prevent public bitterness. The cruelty lay not in the terms, but in the speed. One man moved out of the apartment, another moved in. The staircase connected the same rooms to the same chambers above. Only the occupant changed. By the early 1770s, Orlov's position had eroded. He was replaced. And then came the man who transformed the entire system from a personal arrangement into something resembling a Keo-regency. Grigory Potemkin was a cavalry officer who had lost the use of one eye. The precise cause is still debated, with illness being more historically credible than the romanticized duel story that attached itself to his legend. He became Catherine's lover around 1774. What followed was unlike anything the Russian court or any European court had seen. Over 1,000 letters survive between Catherine and Potemkin, and they are among the most remarkable documents in the history of royal correspondence. She called him my golden pheasant, my tiger, my darling. In the same letters, she issued military orders, discussed the governance of newly acquired territories, analysed diplomatic intelligence, and debated questions of administrative reform. The correspondence reveals a relationship that cannot be reduced to romance, politics, or partnership alone. It was all three simultaneously operating at a level of mutual dependence that made Potemkin not merely a favourite, but something closer to a co-ruler. Many historians believe they were secretly married, possibly at the Church of St. Samson in St. Petersburg. The evidence is suggestive. References to husband and wife appear repeatedly in their private correspondence. The tone of certain letters implies a bond with religious sanction, but no marriage certificate has ever been found. The question remains formally unresolved. Potemkin received the governance of New Russia, the vast southern territories stretching to the Black Sea. He commanded armies. He founded cities. In 1783, he oversaw the annexation of Crimea, incorporating an entire strategic peninsula into the Russian Empire. He governed an area larger than many independent European nations. And then he did the thing that made the favourite system structurally unique. When the romantic relationship between Potemkin and Catherine shifted, he reportedly remained involved in the selection and approval of her subsequent favourites. The most powerful man in the system managed his own replacements. He retained political partnership while surrendering personal intimacy. The favourite's apartment kept receiving new occupants, but the architecture of power above it, the real architecture, now ran through Potemkin's hands as much as Catherine's. Anna Protasova and other intermediaries reportedly served as go-betweens in the vetting process. Contemporary diplomatic dispatches describe the arrangement in blunt, detailed terms. The bureaucratization of Catherine's intimate life was not a scandal whispered in corridors. It was observed, documented, and reported to foreign governments as a functioning feature of Russian imperial politics. But the system devoured the men inside it. Alexander Lanskoy became Catherine's favourite in 1780 and died 4 years later in 1784. He was 26 years old. The cause was likely diphtheria, though some contemporaries whispered about poisoning without producing credible evidence. Catherine's grief was enormous and, by every available account, genuine. She withdrew from court for weeks. She later wrote that she had to drag herself back to the work of governance. The personal devastation was real. The system, however, was not interrupted for long. A new favourite was installed within months. The machine continued. It had to. It was not built for sentiment. It was built for function. Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov was dismissed after his own affair with another woman at court was discovered. Alexander Dmitriev Mamonov departed after falling in love with a lady-in-waiting, a betrayal not of Catherine's body, but of the exclusive arrangement that made the system work. The pattern repeated with mechanical consistency. Each man entered the apartment, climbed the staircase, accumulated wealth and influence, and eventually departed through death, romantic betrayal, personal failure, or simple replacement. The apartment outlasted all of them. And then came Platon Zubov, and the system revealed its most uncomfortable contradiction. Zubov was 22 years old when he became Catherine's last official favourite in 1789. Catherine was 60. The age gap was 38 years. Zubov was a Horse Guards officer with ambition, physical appeal, and social grace, but without the political genius, military experience, or administrative talent that had made Potemkin irreplaceable. When Potemkin died in 1791, collapsing on a roadside in Bessarabia, far from the court during the ongoing Russo-Turkish War, the vacancy he left in the system was catastrophic. Catherine was stricken with grief. She reportedly wept for days and could barely function. Zubov received the governance of New Russia, Potemkin's old domain. Diplomatic observers noted with increasing concern that the system which had once elevated brilliant, capable men now elevated a man whose primary qualification was youth. The favourite's apartment held the same institutional power. The person inside it no longer matched. The entire time, watching from the margins, Paul waited. Catherine's son, the heir she had been forced to surrender to Empress Elizabeth as an infant, the child whose paternity remained a permanent open question, the man who knew exactly how his legal father had died, had been kept from meaningful political power for 34 years. He lived at his estate in Gatchina, maintained a small personal court, drilled his own soldiers in Prussian-style formations that consciously echoed his father Peter's obsessions, and watched from a distance as men younger than himself climbed the concealed staircase and accumulated the influence, appointments, and wealth that should have been flowing toward the heir to the Russian Empire. There were persistent reports, widely discussed by historians, though never conclusively proven, that Catherine drafted a decree changing the succession in favour of Paul's son Alexander, bypassing Paul entirely. Whether this document existed and was destroyed, or whether it was discussed but never formalised, remains one of the most contested questions in Russian imperial history. The logic, if true, was brutally consistent. Catherine had seized the throne from her husband on the grounds that he was unfit to rule. If she believed her son was equally unfit, the same principle applied. The woman who had overthrown one Tsar was prepared, reportedly to disinherit another. She never had the chance. On the 16th of November, 1796, Catherine suffered a massive stroke in her private chambers in the Winter Palace. She collapsed on the floor. Servants carried her to her bedroom, but her body could not be lifted into bed. A mattress was placed on the floor, an improvised deathbed inside a palace containing over 1,000 rooms. She died the following day, the 17th of November, at the age of 67. She had ruled for 34 years. She had expanded Russian territory by over 200,000 square miles. She had corresponded as an intellectual equal with Voltaire, Diderot, and the Baron von Grimm. She had built the Hermitage collection from an initial purchase of 225 paintings from the Berlin merchant Johann Ernst Gotskowski in 1764 into a gallery of over 4,000 works by the time of her death. She had reformed law, founded cities, reorganized provincial administration, patronized architecture, and governed one of the most complex empires on earth, while simultaneously maintaining a private system of personal and political intimacy that had no parallel in European monarchy. The mattress on the floor was the last physical space she occupied. What the world chose to remember was something else entirely. Paul became Tsar immediately. His revenge was calculated, symbolic, and devastating. He ordered the remains of Peter III exhumed from the Alexander Nevsky monastery and reinterred with full imperial honours alongside Catherine at the Peter and Paul fortress. The coffin was carried in a public procession through the streets of St. Petersburg. Paul forced the surviving conspirators from the 1762 coup, including aging members of the Orlov family, to walk in the funeral cortege. Alexei Orlov was given the particular indignity of carrying Peter's crown upon a velvet cushion before the coffin. The ceremony was not a funeral, it was a trial. The son used his father's coffin to convict his mother's lovers and punish her entire political legacy before the public, the court, and the diplomatic community. In 1797, Paul introduced a strict male primogeniture succession law, explicitly designed to ensure that no woman could ever seize the Russian throne through a palace coup again. The law was not governance. It was a monument to 34 years of resentment. Platon Zubov's position evaporated overnight. The apartment, the staircase, the estates, the governance of New Russia, the political access, all of it dissolved the moment Catherine stopped breathing. The system had no succession mechanism because it had never been designed to survive her. It was not an institution. It was an extension of one person's will. Zubov survived the transition, though. He resurfaced in 1801 as a participant in the conspiracy that assassinated Paul I, strangled by officers in his own bedroom at the Mikhailovsky Castle, a building Paul had constructed specifically because he believed the Winter Palace was too dangerous to sleep in. The tradition of coups by guards that Catherine had perfected consumed her own son. Zubov died in 1822 in relative obscurity, a man who had governed an empire's southern frontier and ended his life remembered mostly for being the youngest man in the apartment at the top of the concealed staircase. The marble palace, commissioned for Grigory Orlov at ruinous cost, was never occupied by him in its completed form. Orlov died in 1783, reportedly showing signs of severe mental deterioration, 2 years before construction finished. Catherine bought the palace from Orlov's heirs and gave it to her grandson. Today it houses a branch of the Russian Museum. The Torrid Palace, the magnificent residence given to Potemkin, later became the seat of the State Duma, the building itself tracking the transfer of power from personal patronage to representative government. The Church of St. Samson, where Catherine and Potemkin may or may not have married, still stands in St. Petersburg. Poniatowski, the lover Catherine made King of Poland in 1764, presided helplessly over the three partitions, 1772, 1793, and 1795, that erased Poland from the map of Europe. He died in 1798 in St. Petersburg, a pensioner of the empire that had destroyed his kingdom. She had elevated him to a throne and then dismantled every stone of the kingdom underneath it. Catherine's memoirs were not published until decades after her death. Alexander Herzen printed a version in London in 1859. The manuscripts she had spent years writing, revising, and reshaping. Her literary performance of the broken marriage, the hostile court, the arranged lovers, The political education that transformed a borrowed wardrobe princess into an empress entered public consciousness long after anyone who had known her personally could challenge a single line. The most widely cited source for Catherine's private life was, at its core, a piece of carefully constructed autobiography written by a woman who understood that controlling information was as essential as controlling armies. The evidence itself was a performance. The memoirs told the version she wanted told. And then there is the lie. The grotesque, persistent, completely baseless myth about the circumstances of Catherine's death, the one involving a horse, has no documentary support of any kind. No contemporary account, no medical report, no diplomatic dispatch, no court record, no servant's testimony, nothing. It appears to have originated from hostile foreign propaganda or anti-Catherine gossip, almost certainly designed to reduce the most accomplished female sovereign in European history to a single degrading image. The fabrication has no more historical basis than a fairy tale. She died of a stroke. She died on a mattress on the floor. She died because her body could not be lifted into bed. Every surviving piece of evidence confirms this. The lie has outlived nearly every one of her actual achievements in popular memory. The woman who annexed Crimea, built the Hermitage, reformed Russian law corresponded with Voltaire, and governed an empire for 3.5 decades is remembered by millions of people for something that never happened. The apartment is still there. The staircase is still there. The Hermitage, with its thousands of works, is still there, one of the most visited museums on Earth, built on the foundation of 225 paintings purchased by a woman who wanted to prove that Russia belonged to European civilization. The letters to Potemkin, more than 1,000 of them filled with pet names and military strategy, governance orders and jealousy, affection and administrative reform, survive in archives. The Marble Palace stands on the Neva embankment. The Tauride Palace stands. The Peter and Paul Fortress holds Catherine's remains in the same cathedral as the husband she overthrew and the son who tried to erase her legacy by forcing her lovers to carry his father's coffin through the streets. Visitors walk through the Winter Palace every day. They pass corridors where favourites were installed and replaced. They walk above the apartment where at least 12 men moved in and moved out over 34 years. They stand near the concealed staircase that connected private desire to imperial authority, intimate politics to territorial expansion, one woman's loneliness to one empire's power. Most of them do not know what the staircase was for. Most of them have heard the lie. Almost none of them have read the letters.